A house is never just an assemblage of wood, brick, and glass. It is a silent witness, a living library of every argument that ever echoed off its walls, every laugh that ever made the floorboards tremble, every tear that was ever absorbed into its worn-out furniture. It is the sacred archive of a family's story, a place of origin, a final sanctuary for memories too fragile to be held anywhere else. But what happens when the very people who share those memories decide that they are for sale? What happens when they pick up the gavel themselves and with cold, clear eyes sell your entire history to the highest bidder? For Liam, standing across the street on a gray Tuesday afternoon, the soul of his world had just been pronounced dead. The cause of death was a single, brutal word slashed in scarlet letters across a plastic sign hammered into the lawn: sold. It stood there, an unholy monument on the grass he had mowed 1,000 times, in the yard where his mother had planted her roses. Each letter felt like a personal wound, a final, public declaration of a betrayal so deep it had left him hollow. He hadn't wanted to sell. This house was the last piece of his mother he had left, the vessel that held the echoes of her voice and the faint scent of her perfume in the upstairs hallway. But he had been outvoted, cornered, and ultimately broken down, not by strangers or by misfortune, but by his own blood. His brother, Mark, with his eyes full of dollar signs and impatience. His sister, Chloe, with her crocodile tears and the whispers of her greedy husband in her ear. He remembered the meeting at the kitchen table, the same table where they had shared countless meals and celebrated birthdays. It had been transformed into a courtroom where he was the sole defendant, accused of the crime of sentimentality. They had called him selfish for clinging to the past. They had called him foolish for not seeing the opportunity locked within the walls. They had come with lawyers' numbers and market analyses, their voices a chilling chorus of practicality that drowned out the quiet pleas of his heart. In the end, he had signed the papers, his signature a shaky testament to his defeat. They had mistaken his grief for weakness, his silence for surrender. They saw a man who had lost. They had no idea they were looking at a man who was simply beginning a war. For in that deafening silence, as he watched them celebrate their victory, a seed of cold, patient resolve had been planted, and he would tend to it, in the dark, until it was ready to bloom. To understand the depth of this fracture, you must first understand the family as it once was, or perhaps, as it pretended to be. From a distance, the Miller family was a portrait of quiet, suburban America, the kind you'd see in a faded photograph on a dusty mantelpiece. A strong mother, Eleanor, and her 3 children, all grown, all with lives of their own. But like any old photograph, if you looked closely, you could see the edges beginning to curl, the colors starting to fade, and the faint, hairline cracks spreading across the smiling faces. The cracks had always been there, held together only by the sheer force of Eleanor's love. Her passing was not just a loss, it was a tectonic shift, and the fault lines that had been dormant for decades began to grind against one another with a terrible, inevitable pressure. At the center of this seismic event was Liam, the youngest son. He was a quiet man by nature, not out of shyness, but out of a deep-seated thoughtfulness that the modern world often mistakes for passivity. He had his mother's observant eyes and her patient hands. Years ago, he had been on a promising track, studying historical preservation with a genuine passion for the stories that old buildings held. But when his father passed away and his mother's health began its slow, inexorable decline, Liam made a choice that would define his life. While his siblings were building careers and families, he moved back into the house on Chestnut Street. He became his mother's primary caregiver, a role he accepted not as a burden, but as an honor. His days fell into a gentle, repeating rhythm. Mornings were for medications and soft-boiled eggs. Afternoons were for reading aloud from novels in the sunlit living room. And evenings were for old movies and the quiet hum of the house settling for the night. He became an expert in the subtle language of her illness, knowing the difference between a sigh of contentment and a sigh of pain. He learned to tend her beloved garden, coaxing life from the very same soil she had worked for 40 years. For Liam, the house was not just a structure, it was an extension of his mother. Her presence was baked into the very plaster of the walls. He could feel her in the worn floral armchair in the corner, see her in the way the light filtered through the kitchen window she had always said was her favorite, hear her in the familiar creak of the third stair on the way to her bedroom. To give up the house would be like performing an amputation on his own memory, a second, more brutal death. He was the keeper of the flame, the guardian of their shared history, and he could not imagine a world where that flame was extinguished. Then there was Mark, the eldest, a man who moved through the world as if he owned it, or at least as if he were perpetually on the verge of a hostile takeover. Mark measured life in quarterly earnings reports and square footage. He lived in a sprawling modern house in a new development on the other side of town, a place with more garage doors than character, where every lawn was unnaturally green. He drove a leased German sedan and spoke a language of leverage, assets, and monetization. To Mark, emotion was a liability, and nostalgia was a wasted investment. He loved his mother, in his own transactional way, but he saw her passing as the closing of one chapter and the opening of another, a chapter that involved liquidating what he saw as a dormant asset. The house on Chestnut Street was, in his eyes, a pile of equity just sitting there, gathering dust. He saw its sale not as the erasure of a past, but as the funding for his future, a crucial injection of capital for a high-risk tech venture he was convinced would make him a legend. His wife, Jessica, was Mark's perfect counterpart, a woman who wore her ambition like a piece of expensive jewelry. She viewed Liam's devotion to his mother with a kind of polite bewilderment that bordered on disdain. In her social circle, aging parents were handled by expensive care facilities, not by sacrificing one's own life. She found the old house charming, in a way a museum might be charming, nice to visit for an hour, but utterly impractical to live with. It was small, it was dated, and it was, in her opinion, holding the entire family back, a sentimental anchor in a world that rewarded speed and ruthlessness. She was the one who first planted the seed in Mark's ear that Liam's desire to keep the house was not noble but deeply selfish, a way of preventing everyone else from moving on. And caught between these two opposing forces was Chloe, the youngest of the three, a woman who had spent her entire life feeling like she was a step behind. She lacked Mark's aggressive confidence and Liam's quiet self-assurance, and this insecurity made her deeply susceptible to the influence of others. She loved Liam, and she genuinely grieved for their mother, but she was married to a man named David. David was a salesman, both by profession and by nature, and the product he sold most effectively was a sense of grievance. He had convinced Chloe that her life of quiet struggle, of living paycheck to paycheck and always wanting more, was a grand injustice. He painted a picture for her where the house was not a home, but a lottery ticket. It was her rightful inheritance, a key that could unlock the life she saw on social media, the European vacations, the designer clothes, the freedom from financial anxiety. David was the whisper in her ear, constantly reminding her of what she was owed, stoking her resentment until it burned hotter than her grief. He made her believe that holding on to the house was holding her down, and that true love for her mother would be to use the inheritance to finally build a happy life for herself. And so the stage was set. The three siblings, each standing on their own island of belief, separated by a widening sea of grief and greed. And in the middle of it all stood the house itself. It was a modest, two-story colonial, painted a pale yellow with dark green shutters. It wasn't grand, but it was honest. A sprawling oak tree, older than any of them, stood sentinel in the front yard. In the back, Eleanor's garden was a riot of color in the summer peonies and hydrangeas fighting for space with stubborn perennials. Inside, it smelled of old books, lemon polish, and the faint, lingering scent of a life well lived. It was a home built not with a blueprint of ambition, but with a foundation of love, sacrifice, and shared time. It was a fortress of memory, and its walls were about to be placed under siege, not by an outside enemy, but by the very people it had been built to protect. The end, when it came for Eleanor, was as peaceful as the life she had tried to build. It arrived not with a roar, but with a quiet exhale in the pre-dawn stillness of her own bedroom, with Liam's hand holding hers. The house seemed to sigh with her, a final, settling groan of old timbers that marked the end of an era. For a long moment, there was only a profound silence, a void where the soft sound of her breathing had been a constant, comforting presence for years. Then, Liam did the only thing he could. He let go of her hand, walked over to the window that overlooked her garden, and watched the sun begin to rise, feeling the cold glass against his forehead as the first, hollow pangs of a world without her began to set in. The days that followed were a blur of prescribed rituals. The phone calls, the hushed condolences, the endless casseroles left on the doorstep. Mark arrived first, his grief organized and efficient. He took charge of the funeral arrangements with the same brisk authority he used to run his business meetings, creating lists and delegating tasks, his sorrow manifesting as a problem to be managed. Chloe and David came soon after. Chloe's grief, a loud, theatrical storm of tears that seemed to require David's constant public comforting. Liam remained at the center of it all, a quiet island of genuine sorrow in a sea of performative mourning. He moved through the motions, spoke when spoken to, and accepted the hugs of well-meaning neighbors, all the while feeling a strange and unsettling detachment, as if he were watching a play about his own life. At the funeral, the facade of family unity was perfectly maintained. They stood side by side, 3 grieving children farewelling a beloved mother. Friends of Eleanor would approach Liam, their eyes soft with pity and admiration. "You were such a good son to her, Liam." One of them, a woman named Mrs. Gable from next door, whispered, patting his arm. "She was so proud of you. This old house won't be the same without her spirit in it." Liam could only nod, a lump forming in his throat. Beside him, he saw Mark offer a tight, polite smile, while Chloe's eyes darted nervously towards David. The words, meant to comfort, had instead drawn a faint, invisible line in the sand. The official severing of their past occurred 1 week later, in the climate-controlled stillness of a lawyer's office downtown. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and stale coffee. Mr. Abernathy, a kind but weary man who had handled the Miller family's affairs for decades, sat behind a large mahogany desk, peering at them over his reading glasses. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. Mark sat forward in his chair, a picture of impatient anticipation. Chloe fidgeted with the strap of her purse, her gaze fixed on the floor. Liam simply stared at a framed photograph of a sailboat on the wall, wishing he were anywhere else. Mr. Abernathy began to read the last will and testament of Eleanor Miller. It was a simple document, for she had been a simple woman. Her modest savings, her jewelry, her personal effects, all were divided meticulously and fairly among the 3 of them. There were no surprises, no hidden dramas. Liam felt a small measure of relief. Perhaps, he thought, this could be done with dignity. And then, Mr. Abernathy arrived at the final, most significant clause. "Regarding my primary residence," he read, his voice taking on a more solemn tone. "The property located at 12 Chestnut Street, with all its furnishings and effects. It is my will that it be bequeathed in equal shares, as tenants in common, to my 3 beloved children, Mark Miller, Chloe Miller, Hanson, and Liam Miller." He paused, looking up at them. "She also included a personal note here," he added, his expression softening. He cleared his throat again and continued. "It is my deepest wish that this home, which has been the heart of our family for so long, remains a gathering place for all of you, a repository of our memories, and a source of comfort for as long as you shall all see fit." In the silence that followed, Liam felt a fragile hope bloom in his chest. A wish. It wasn't a legally binding mandate, but it was his mother's voice, a clear and loving instruction from beyond the grave. He looked at his siblings, expecting to see a flicker of shared understanding, a nod to their mother's final desire. He saw nothing. Mark's face was a mask of careful neutrality, his eyes already doing calculations Liam couldn't begin to fathom. Chloe looked lost, until her eyes met David's, who gave her a look of such subtle encouragement that it was almost invisible. The spell was broken. The war began not with a bang, but with a conversation over lukewarm coffee back at the house that afternoon. The sympathy cards were still piled on the dining table, but the pretense of shared grief had evaporated. It was Mark who fired the first shot, cloaking it in the language of concern. "All right," he said, setting his mug down with a decisive click. We need to have a serious conversation about the house. We need to be pragmatic about this." Liam frowned. "Pragmatic? What is there to talk about? We just heard Mom's wish." "A wish is not a business plan, Liam," Mark retorted, his voice patient, as if explaining a complex concept to a child. "She left us the house, equal shares. It's an asset, a significant one. And right now, it's not doing anything for anyone. The market is hot. If we sell now, we can unlock its value and all walk away with a substantial amount of money." Jessica, Mark's wife, chimed in smoothly. "He's right, Liam. Think of the upkeep, the property taxes, the insurance, the inevitable repairs an old house needs. It's a financial drain. Selling it would be the responsible thing to do. It would give everyone a fresh start." Chloe, seeing her opening, spoke up, her voice trembling slightly, a performance she had no doubt rehearsed with David. "And we could really use it, Liam. We're trying to save for a down payment on a bigger place for the kids. This would change everything for us. Mom would want us to be secure, wouldn't she?" Liam looked from one face to the next, a cold wave of disbelief washing over him. It was as if they had all been handed a sacred text, and he was the only one who had bothered to read it. "Did you not hear a word Mr. Abernathy said?" he asked, his voice low and strained. "Her deepest wish, that it remain a gathering place? This is Mom's home. This is our home. We grew up here. Every scratch on that doorway is from Mark's hockey sticks. That stain on the carpet is from Chloe spilling grape juice at her 5th birthday party. You want to sell that? You want to put a price tag on our entire childhood?" His appeal to sentimentality was like throwing a pebble against a fortress. It made no impact. Mark sighed, a sound of profound disappointment. "Liam, that's exactly the kind of thinking that holds people back. You can't live in a museum. Memories are in your head, not in a pile of bricks. We have an opportunity here. A real, tangible opportunity to better our lives. To better our children's lives. Are you really going to stand in the way of that because of a juice stain?" The conversation was over before it had truly begun. They saw his love for the house as a weakness, his grief as a stubborn refusal to face reality. He was outnumbered. He looked at his brother's cold ambition, his sister's desperate and manufactured need, and felt utterly, completely alone. He was no longer just a grieving son, sitting in his mother's kitchen. He was the last defender of a legacy that no one else cared to remember, the sole guardian of a home that his own family now viewed as nothing more than a cage made of memories, a cage they were determined to smash open to get to the prize inside. The fragile hope Liam had felt in the lawyer's office was a delicate seedling that could not survive the frost that followed. In the weeks after the will was read, the house on Chestnut Street ceased to be a home. It became a territory under dispute, a silent stage for a cold war waged with whispered phone calls and poisoned words. The air grew thick with unspoken resentments, and every creak of the floorboard seemed to echo the fracturing of their family. Liam found himself living in a ghost house, haunted not by the memory of his mother, but by the hungry ambitions of his siblings. The assault was a carefully orchestrated two-pronged attack, a textbook psychological campaign designed to wear him down. Chloe was the vanguard of emotional warfare. She would call him at odd hours, her voice a fragile, trembling thing, expertly weaponizing her own perceived vulnerability. "I couldn't sleep last night, Liam," she would begin, a manufactured sob catching in her throat. "I just kept thinking about Mom and how much she hated it when we fought." She would weave their mother's memory into a tapestry of guilt, twisting Eleanor's love into a justification for her own greed. "You know she would want us to be happy, to be secure. She never wanted to be a burden. And this house, it's becoming a burden on all of us, on our relationship. Keeping it is what's tearing us apart, don't you see?" She would talk endlessly about her children, painting a bleak picture of their future, a future that Liam, and only Liam, was single-handedly jeopardizing with his selfishness. He was denying his niece a chance at a better school, his nephew the space to play. The calls always ended with her crying, leaving Liam feeling like a cruel monster, a villain in a story he didn't even know he was writing. When Chloe's appeals to his heart failed to produce the desired result, Mark would launch the second wave of attack, targeting his mind. His calls were brusque, impatient, and laced with a condescending disappointment that was far more cutting than outright anger. He dealt in facts and figures, in market volatility and capital gains. His words a barrage of business speak designed to make Liam feel small, naive, and hopelessly out of touch. "Let me put this in terms you can understand, Liam," he'd say, the patronizing tone making Liam's skin crawl. "Every day we don't sell, we are losing money. It's financially illiterate to keep a non-performing asset like this in a portfolio. It's just bad business." He would belittle Liam's life, framing his sacrifice as a long-term vacation. "It's been easy for you, hasn't it? No rent, no mortgage, no real-world pressures. But some of us have responsibilities. I have a family to support, a business to run. You can't expect us to subsidize your sentimental attachment to the past. It's time to grow up and face reality." The pressure was relentless, a pincer movement closing in on him. Jessica would send him texts with links to articles on the Swedish death cleaning method or the psychological benefits of minimalism, a passive-aggressive campaign implying his desire to keep his mother's things was a form of mental illness. David, on the other hand, dropped all pretense of subtlety. He showed up one afternoon unannounced, finding Liam in the garden, trying to salvage their mother's dying roses. He draped a familiar arm over Liam's shoulder, a gesture of false camaraderie that felt more like a threat. "Listen, pal," he said, his voice low and conspiratorial. "Chloe's a wreck over this. It's tearing her up. We don't want to get nasty. We really don't. But she has rights. We have a legal claim to a third of this property's value. We can't just let that go. I know you'll do the right thing. For her." Liam held his ground, but he was weary. His grief was a heavy cloak he couldn't take off, and the constant attacks were exhausting him, sapping his will to fight. He felt cornered in his own home, a stranger among his own memories. The final, decisive blow did not come via a phone call or a backhanded comment. It arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by the mailman, in a stiff, cream-colored envelope bearing the embossed letterhead of a law firm he had never heard of. His hands trembled as he opened it. The letter was 4 pages of dense, impenetrable legalese, but its message was brutally clear. It spoke of their repeated attempts to amicably resolve the disposition of the asset. It mentioned their fiduciary responsibilities, but it was a single phrase in the 3rd paragraph that made the air leave his lungs. Partition by sale. Liam didn't know the exact legal definition, but the letter went on to explain it in chillingly simple terms. It was a formal petition to the court, a lawsuit. If he refused to cooperate, they would sue him, and a judge would order the house to be sold at a public auction. The proceeds, after the substantial legal fees for both sides were deducted, would then be split. It was checkmate. They knew he didn't have the money to hire a lawyer to fight them. They knew he didn't have the stomach for a public, ugly court battle that would drag their family name and their mother's memory through the mud. It was a declaration that their relationship was no longer governed by blood or love, but by statutes and billable hours. He was no longer their brother, he was an opposing party in a legal dispute. They had taken his grief and used it as a tactical advantage, waiting until he was at his most vulnerable to deliver the killing stroke. That night, Liam didn't sleep. He sat in his mother's worn floral armchair in the living room, the legal letter resting on his lap, and let the full weight of his defeat settle over him. The house was silent, but for the first time, it didn't feel peaceful. It felt like a tomb. He had failed. He couldn't protect his mother's final wish. He couldn't protect their home. He could fight, but it would be a bitter, destructive, and ultimately futile gesture. The house would be sold anyway, its soul carved up by lawyers and auctioneers, its memory forever tainted by the ugliness of the battle. He couldn't bear that. A clean wound, he decided, was better than a festering one. The next morning, with eyes gritty from lack of sleep, he picked up the phone and called Mark. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. His voice was flat, hollowed out. "You win," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "I'll sign whatever you want me to sign." There was a moment of silence on the other end, then Mark's voice, crisp and triumphant, without a trace of sympathy. "Good. It's about time you came to your senses. I'll have the realtor draw up the listing agreement." "Wait," Liam said, a spark of something hard and defiant igniting in the pit of his stomach. "I have one condition." What is it?" Mark asked, his tone wary. "I want a month," Liam stated, his voice gaining a sliver of its strength back. 30 days. From the moment we sign, the house is mine for that month. I want to go through Mom's things, to pack up her life, our life, by myself. No realtors, no open houses, no one. You, Chloe, your spouses. You don't set foot on this property until I'm done, and the key is under the mat. That's the deal." There was a short pause. Mark was likely calculating the cost of a 30-day delay versus the cost of a potential legal fight. The math was simple. "Fine," he conceded. "A month. But not a day longer, Liam. The market is waiting." Liam hung up the phone without another word. He looked around the quiet living room at the furniture that had witnessed his entire life. He had lost the battle for the house. But as he stood there, amidst the ruins of his family, a new, colder, and far more patient strategy began to take root in his mind. He now had 30 days. 30 days to say goodbye. And 30 days to plan. The month Liam had negotiated was a period of profound and solemn ritual. It was not a time of frantic packing, but of careful, deliberate archaeology. He moved through each room of the house with the patience of a historian, documenting a civilization on the verge of extinction. He photographed everything: the way the morning light slanted across the kitchen floor, the intricate patterns of cracks in the ceiling plaster, the collection of mismatched teacups in the china cabinet. He spent hours in the attic, sifting through boxes of old letters and report cards, each piece of paper a ghost of a life already lived. He didn't just pack his mother's belongings into boxes, he curated them, wrapping each fragile memory in tissue paper as if it were a priceless artifact. This was his eulogy, his private memorial service for the home that had raised him. When the final day came, he didn't look back. He placed the key under the mat as promised, got into his modest car, and drove away, leaving behind nothing but empty rooms and the lingering echo of a family that no longer existed. The closing was a sterile, impersonal affair in a downtown office building that smelled of industrial carpet cleaner. Mark was electric with energy, practically vibrating in his chair, shaking hands with the realtor and the buyers with the magnanimous air of a conquering hero. Chloe and David sat huddled together, whispering excitedly, their eyes gleaming with the thrill of imminent wealth. Liam was a specter at the proceedings, a silent, hollowed-out presence. He signed where he was told to sign, his hand steady, his face an unreadable mask. When the checks were distributed, Mark clapped him on the shoulder, a gesture devoid of any real warmth. "See, Liam?" he said, his voice booming. "Painless. Now we can all finally move forward." Liam simply took his check, folded it precisely in half, and walked out without a word. For Mark and Chloe, the money was not a tool for the future. It was a trophy from a battle they had won, and they were eager to display it. Their paths diverged, but they were both fueled by the same desperate, celebratory urgency. Mark, who had always seen himself as a misunderstood financial visionary, made his move within 48 hours. He liquidated the check and poured every single cent into a high-risk tech startup called SynthOStream. It was a company built on buzzwords, artificial intelligence, algorithmic synergy, predictive content curation, and a charismatic founder who spoke of disrupting paradigms and monetizing the future. Mark was completely seduced. He saw himself not as an investor, but as a patron, a Medici for the digital age. He spoke of his investment in grand terms, telling anyone who would listen that he had converted a stagnant domestic asset into a dynamic, high-growth potential instrument. He truly believed he had done something brilliant, that he had rescued his mother's legacy from the dusty irrelevance of a suburban house and launched it into the stratosphere of modern commerce. His brief text to Liam was a single, pitying line. "This is how you build a real legacy. You should try it sometime." Chloe and David's celebration was less conceptual and far more visceral. Their first stop was the bank. Their second was the luxury car dealership. They traded in their sensible sedan for a brand new metallic black SUV, a behemoth of a vehicle with leather seats that still had that intoxicating chemical smell of wealth. It was an audacious, impractical purchase, a statement piece that screamed to the world that they were no longer bound by budgets or good sense. From there, their spending became a blur of instant gratification. They paid off their looming credit card debts, not with the quiet relief of people escaping a burden, but with the swagger of high rollers settling a trivial tab. And then came the grand tour, Europe. For 2 weeks, their social media accounts became a meticulously curated highlight reel of their new life. There was Chloe, laughing with a flute of champagne, the Eiffel Tower sparkling behind her, the caption reading, "To new beginnings, number blessed." There was David, posing with a forced casualness in front of the Colosseum in Rome, sunglasses on, with the hashtag number, inheritance well spent. They posted pictures of expensive dinners, designer shopping bags, and infinity pools overlooking the Mediterranean coast. Each post was a carefully aimed projectile, a declaration of victory and vindication intended for an audience of friends, neighbors, and most pointedly, the brother they had left behind. They were not just having a vacation, they were performing a drama of success, a loud and glittering spectacle designed to drown out any lingering whispers of guilt. In all this time, Liam heard nothing from them directly. The single text from Mark was the last communication he would receive. His phone, which had once been bombarded with their manipulative calls, fell silent. He had been surgically removed from their lives, an inconvenient reminder of a past they were spending a fortune to escape. He watched their progress from the quiet anonymity of his small, rented apartment, a place with bare walls and secondhand furniture. He saw the pictures of the new car, the exotic locations, the triumphant smiles. A distant cousin called, ostensibly to see how he was, but really to gossip about Chloe's lavish trip. "It must be nice," the cousin said, her voice dripping with insinuation, "to see them enjoying their mother's memory so much." But Liam felt no anger, no jealousy. What he felt was a strange and chilling sense of calm, a dispassionate certainty that was as solid and as cold as granite. Every boastful post, every gaudy purchase, every desperate hashtag was not an insult to him, but a confirmation of his judgment. They were not building new lives, they were gleefully setting fire to their old ones, using their inheritance as kindling. He watched them like a scientist observing an experiment, taking meticulous mental notes as they proved his hypothesis correct, time and time again. They believed the money was their reward. They had no idea it was the bait. And as he sat in the quiet of his new, Spartan life, carefully investing his own share, researching, planning, and waiting, he knew one thing with absolute clarity. They were celebrating the end of a race, while he was just methodically lacing up his shoes for a marathon. While Mark's inheritance vanished into the digital ether of a theoretical future, and Chloe's was converted into a fleeting montage of European vistas and depreciating leather, Liam's share simply disappeared. To the outside world, and to the distant relatives who whispered about the Miller family tragedy, Liam had taken his portion and retreated into a life of quiet obscurity. He rented a small, characterless one-bedroom apartment in a neighboring town, a place so anonymous it was practically invisible. He was the grieving son, the sentimental fool who had lost the battle, now left to lick his wounds in a state of diminished circumstances. This was the narrative his siblings comforted themselves with. It was a profoundly mistaken one. Liam's new apartment was not a home, it was a chrysalis. He brought with him only the essentials, some clothes, his books, and the carefully cataloged boxes containing the true essence of the house on Chestnut Street. For the first few months, he did nothing but grieve. He allowed the full, crushing weight of his dual loss, his mother and his family, to wash over him. He disconnected from the noise of the world, deleting his social media accounts and silencing the phone that no longer rang anyway. He worked his way through the boxes of memories, not with sorrow, but with a quiet reverence. He read his mother's old letters, looked at faded photographs, and let the stories they told settle into the marrow of his bones. He was not clinging to the past. He was absorbing its lessons, distilling its wisdom. It was a period of intense, painful, and necessary solitude. Then, one day, the grieving stopped being a passive state and became an active one. He was holding a small, worn wooden bird his father had carved for his mother decades ago. He remembered his father saying, "The strength of the wood isn't on the surface, son. It's in the grain, in the patient way it grows." In that moment, something shifted within him. Grief was no longer an anchor, it became a compass. His purpose, he realized, was not to mourn what was lost, but to build something that honored the true legacy of his parents, a legacy of patience, prudence, and quiet, unshakable strength. The silence his siblings had imposed on him was not a punishment, it was an opportunity. During the long, quiet years of caring for Eleanor, when the nights were slow and the house was still, Liam had done more than just tend to his mother. He had tended to his own mind. He had read voraciously, not fiction, but dense textbooks on economics, finance, and real estate law. He had completed dozens of online courses, learning the intricate dance of markets and the sober language of balance sheets. He had done it out of a quiet curiosity, a desire to understand the world that his brother claimed to have mastered. He had been preparing for a future without ever knowing what it would be. Now, he knew. He was a man armed with knowledge, a significant amount of capital, and a singular, all-consuming focus. His strategy was the antithesis of his brother's. There would be no flashy gambles, no get-rich-quick schemes. His was a philosophy of slow, deliberate growth, of building a fortress brick by brick. He divided his inheritance into 3 parts. The first went into the stock market, but not into volatile tech startups. He bought into the giants, the unshakable pillars of the American economy. Blue-chip industrials, reliable utility companies, and index funds that tracked the steady, upward march of the market. It was boring, it was predictable, and it was profitable. The second part went into bonds and high-yield savings, a bedrock of stability that generated a quiet, reliable income. The third part was where his personal passion met his financial acumen. He took a portion of the money and made a modest real estate investment. He found a small, neglected duplex in a working-class neighborhood, a building with good bones that reminded him of a project he had studied in his old preservation courses. He bought it outright, with cash, and then he went to work. He spent his days stripping old wallpaper, sanding floors, and reglazing windows. He did most of the labor himself, pouring his grief and anger into the physical act of restoration. He was not just fixing a building, he was rebuilding himself. Within a few months, he had transformed the rundown property into 2 clean, safe, and desirable apartments, which he quickly rented out to a young teacher and a retired couple. The steady stream of rental income was just a bonus. The real prize was the proof of concept. He could create value where others saw only decay. But the cornerstone of his grand design was an act of profound foresight, a move made in the deepest shadows of his new, quiet life. He sought out a small, discreet law firm in a city an hour away, a place where no one knew his name. There, he created a legal entity, a limited liability company. He named it Ironwood Holdings, LLC. The name was carefully chosen. Ironwood is a tree known for its incredible density and durability, a wood that is notoriously difficult to cut, a wood that grows slowly but with immense strength. The LLC was Liam's shield and his sword. It was structured with layers of legal protection, making its true ownership nearly impossible to trace for a casual observer. On paper, Ironwood Holdings was a faceless, passionless investment group. In reality, it was the vessel for Liam's will, an instrument of patient, methodical, and silent power. As the months turned into a year, an incredible transformation took place. While his siblings' fortunes were loudly and publicly disintegrating, Liam's was quietly and privately compounding. He continued to live his Spartan existence, his lifestyle, a secret he kept from the world. He drove the same 10-year-old car, wore the same simple clothes, and his largest weekly expense was groceries. From the outside, he was still the poor, forgotten brother. But behind the closed door of his anonymous apartment, Liam Miller was methodically becoming a very wealthy man. The silence he inhabited was no longer empty. It was filled with the low, steady hum of an engine he had built from scratch, an engine of wealth and power that was picking up speed with every passing day. And no one, least of all the 2 people who had put him there, could hear it coming. For over a year, Liam's world was one of quiet, monastic discipline. He moved in a cocoon of silence, his life governed by spreadsheets, market reports, and the slow, satisfying work of renovating his small duplex. He had walled himself off from the drama of his former life, and in that self-imposed exile, he had found a kind of peace. He expected to hear nothing from his siblings, and for a long time, he was right. Their worlds, once so violently intertwined with his, had spun off into their own orbits. But the laws of gravity, both cosmic and karmic, are patient, and they are absolute. And after a year of silence, the first, faint tremors of their inevitable re-entry began to reach him. The news about Mark came first, not in a direct call, but through the ever-efficient and often dramatic channel of the family grapevine. His Aunt Carol, his mother's sister, called one evening, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "Liam, honey, I probably shouldn't be telling you this," she began, which was always her preamble to telling him exactly what she shouldn't. "But I'm worried sick about Mark. Have you spoken to him?" Liam confirmed that he hadn't, and the floodgates opened. It turned out Mark had called his cousin Richard, a dentist with a successful practice, and asked for a loan. A significant one. $50,000. Mark had called it bridge financing, a temporary measure to cover a minor cash flow problem at his revolutionary tech company. But Richard, being a cautious man, had done a little digging. The story Aunt Carol relayed was one of predictable, spectacular failure. SynthOStream, the company that was supposed to be Mark's legacy, had been nothing more than a geyser of burning cash. They had secured a sleek, absurdly expensive office in the city's tech district. They had spent a fortune on catered lunches, team-building retreats in wine country, and a launch party that was the talk of the town for a week. They had done everything a successful startup was supposed to do, except for one crucial thing: create a product that actually worked. Their miracle AI was little more than a clever algorithm prone to crashing and delivering nonsensical results. The hype had faded, the next round of funding had never materialized, and the company was now a hollowed-out shell, bleeding money with no hope of a recovery. Mark's entire inheritance, the sum total of his mother's life's work, had been incinerated at the altar of his own ego. Liam listened patiently, thanking his aunt for her concern. He hung up the phone and felt nothing. Not joy, not satisfaction, not even a flicker of schadenfreude. What he felt was a profound and somber sense of inevitability. It was like watching a man who had insisted on building his house on a foundation of sand, and then being told that the tide had finally come in. Mark hadn't been the victim of a bad market or a stroke of bad luck. He had been the victim of his own reflection, of the brilliant, infallible visionary he saw in the mirror every morning. He was too proud, even now, to admit defeat. He was scrambling, borrowing from relatives, patching the holes in a sinking ship with scraps of his own pride, all to avoid the one thing he couldn't face: the truth. And he was certainly too proud to call the one person he had wronged the most. The news about Chloe arrived in a different, more modern way. It came not as a whisper, but as a sudden, deafening silence. For a year, her social media feed had been a relentless chronicle of consumption. The new SUV, the designer clothes, the weekend getaways, the perfectly filtered photos of her children in their expensive private school uniforms. It was a constant, almost manic performance of a life perfected by money. Then, one day, it simply stopped. The daily posts ceased. The cheerful updates were replaced by a digital void. Her vibrant, curated world had gone dark. Through another, more distant family member, the reason for the blackout eventually trickled down to Liam. David, Chloe's husband, and the architect of her financial liberation, had been laid off. He was a salesman in a competitive industry, and after the windfall, his hunger had been replaced by arrogance. He'd grown lazy, coasting on his past successes, and when his company downsized, his mediocre performance had made him an easy choice for the chopping block. The river of money that had fueled their lavish lifestyle had suddenly run dry. The consequences were immediate and catastrophic. The payments on the monstrous SUV were more than their new, reduced circumstances could possibly bear. The credit cards they had so triumphantly paid off were now maxed out once more, this time with even higher interest rates. The illusion of wealth they had so carefully constructed crumbled almost overnight. Liam could picture it perfectly. The hushed, angry arguments in the kitchen after the kids were in bed, the frantic searching for things they could sell, the slow, creeping terror as they realized the money was not just running out, but was already gone. They were trapped in a life they could no longer afford, surrounded by the very trophies of their victory, which had now become the millstones of their defeat. Liam would sit in his quiet apartment at night, his own laptop open to the simple, black and white financial statements of Ironwood Holdings. He would see the steady, upward curve of his own net worth, the result of 1,000 small, sensible decisions. Then he would think of his siblings. He pictured Mark, frantically making phone calls, his voice a mask of false confidence, trying to borrow his way out of a hole he had dug himself. He pictured Chloe, sitting in the dark of her oversized house, the silence of her phone, a terrifying testament to her own isolation. They were both still too proud, too ashamed, to face him. They had celebrated their freedom from the past, only to become prisoners of a future they had recklessly built. He felt a deep, abiding pity for them. But it was the detached pity a doctor might feel for a patient who had refused to take their medicine. He did not reach out. He did not offer a single word of comfort or a single dollar of aid. It was not yet time. They were feeling the pain, but they had not yet understood the lesson. Their pride, the very same pride that had led them to sell their mother's home, was still intact. It was a fever that had not yet broken. And so, Liam continued his quiet work. He managed his properties, he watched his investments grow, and he waited. He did not need to lift a finger to enact his revenge. He simply had to let the inexorable, unforgiving mathematics of their own choices run their course. The cracks in the facade had appeared, and he knew, with a certainty that was as calm as it was cold, that it was only a matter of time before the entire structure came crashing down. If the events of the previous year were the sound of a foundation cracking, the months that followed were the thunderous, deafening roar of a complete and total collapse. The slow erosion of fortune gave way to a sudden, brutal avalanche, and both Mark and Chloe, in their separate worlds of denial, found themselves buried beneath the rubble of their own choices. There was no one left to borrow from, no one left to blame. There was only the cold, hard reality of hitting rock bottom. For Mark, the downfall was a public spectacle, a drawn-out humiliation perfectly tailored to dismantle the very core of his identity. His desperate attempts to secure bridge financing from relatives had failed, and the gossip about his failing company had spread through the family like wildfire. The inevitable happened. Synthostream officially declared bankruptcy, its name appearing in the dry, unforgiving print of the local business journal's legal notices. For a man who defined his existence by the appearance of success, this public declaration of failure was a fate worse than death. But the universe was not yet finished with him. The bankruptcy triggered a cascade of personal disasters. The creditors, no longer held at bay by the illusion of a functioning company, descended upon him personally. His phone became an instrument of torture, ringing incessantly with calls from blocked numbers, each one a disembodied voice demanding money he did not have. Certified letters filled his mailbox, each one escalating the threats of liens and legal action. The sprawling, soulless house he had considered a castle became his prison. And then, the final symbolic blow landed. A foreclosure notice was taped to his front door, and a few weeks later, a bright red, "For Sale" sign was hammered into his perfectly manicured lawn, the very same shade of scarlet as the sign that had once declared his victory on Chestnut Street. The irony was so cruel, so perfect, that it was almost poetic. The final support beam of his life gave way on a Tuesday morning. Jessica, who had married a winner, a titan of industry, found she had no patience for a bankrupt. Her love, it turned out, was not recession-proof. She packed her Louis Vuitton suitcases, her face a mask of cold disappointment. "I can't do this, Mark," she said, her voice devoid of any emotion other than pragmatism. "I won't let the children be exposed to this failure." She didn't cry, she didn't rage. She simply erased him from the equation. He stood at the large picture window and watched as she loaded their 2 children, confused and silent, into her own luxury SUV, the one vehicle that was leased in her name only, and drove away without a backward glance. He was left alone in a cavernous, empty house filled with furniture that would soon be auctioned off, a king with no kingdom, no family, and no future. Chloe's collapse was a quieter, more intimate tragedy, a slow-motion implosion that happened behind the closed doors of the life she had so proudly displayed. The loss of David's job had been the catalyst, and their marriage, which had been built on the flimsy scaffolding of shared materialism, could not withstand the financial strain. The arguments became a daily ritual, a toxic cycle of blame and recrimination. He accused her of being a bottomless pit of wants. She accused him of being a reckless fool who had squandered their one great chance. The love they thought they had was revealed to be nothing more than a partnership in consumption, and with nothing left to consume, the partnership was dissolved. David's departure was as cowardly as it was cruel. He had been secretly lining up his exit for weeks, grooming a new prospect, a recently divorced woman, in his old office with a healthy settlement. One afternoon, while Chloe was out selling a pair of diamond earrings to a pawn shop for a fraction of their worth, he packed a single suitcase and left. He didn't even grant her the dignity of a final confrontation. He left a note on the granite countertop of the kitchen he had once called their dream. It contained all the hollow cliches. I need to find myself. You deserve better. It's not you, it's me. He had drained her inheritance, and now he was draining the last of her dignity. Chloe was left adrift in a sea of debt. The landlord was calling about the lease that was about to expire. The repo man was leaving messages about the giant SUV. She was forced to begin the humiliating process of dismantling her life, piece by expensive piece. The designer handbags went to a consignment store, their value a pittance compared to the validation she had felt when buying them. The brand new furniture was listed on online marketplaces for half its price. Each sale was a small, sharp stab of failure, a public admission that the entire life she had broadcast to the world had been a lie. She was a woman with no job, no husband, no home, and a social media profile that now served as a mocking, digital tombstone for a life she had barely lived. And all the while, as these two storms of ruin raged, Liam's world was one of profound and ever-growing peace. He would spend his Saturdays working in the shared garden behind the duplex he now owned, free and clear. He'd listen to the quiet chatter of his tenants, the young teacher and the retired couple, and feel a sense of satisfaction that was deeper and more real than any pleasure his siblings' money had bought them. He heard the news, of course. Aunt Carol kept him updated with somber, detailed reports on both Mark's bankruptcy and Chloe's divorce. He listened, he offered his sympathies, and he felt a quiet, solemn confirmation. He was the control group in an experiment on the destructive power of greed. While their lives had been a frantic, explosive chemical reaction that had ended in smoke and ash, his had been the slow, silent process of photosynthesis quietly turning light into life. Mark and Chloe had now exhausted every option. They had burned through their money, their marriages, and their friendships. The cousins Mark had tried to borrow from no longer took his calls. The friends Chloe had tried to impress with her wealth now offered only polite, distant excuses. They had become pariahs, toxic reminders of what happens when ambition and insecurity are given a blank check. Alone, in their separate circles of hell, Mark in his cavernous, foreclosed house, and Chloe in her rapidly emptying apartment, they both arrived at the same, terrifying, and inescapable conclusion. There was only one person left, one bridge they hadn't yet burned. The quiet brother they had cast aside, bullied, and left for financially dead. He was their last resort, the final, most humiliating stop on their road to ruin. And so, with nowhere else to turn, they both began to formulate a plan to find him. Nearly 2 years had passed since the sale. 2 years in which Liam Miller had effectively ceased to exist in the eyes of his family. They pictured him, if they pictured him at all, as a ghost haunting the margins of life, a man defined by what he had lost. They could not have been more wrong. Liam was not defined by loss. He was being forged by it. While they were busy setting their worlds on fire, he was quietly, methodically, and brilliantly building a new one. The Spartan apartment had served its purpose as a command center and a crucible, but it was never meant to be a home. With the profits from his first few real estate ventures and the steady, compounding growth of his investment portfolio, Liam had undertaken a personal project. He bought a small plot of land in a quiet, established neighborhood, and drawing on his old passion for historical preservation and design, he built a house. It was not a monument to wealth like the one Mark had lost. It was a testament to craftsmanship and thoughtful design, a modest, elegant craftsman-style bungalow. It had a deep front porch, a fireplace made of river rock, and large windows that flooded the rooms with natural light. He had planted a garden in the back, filled with the kinds of perennials his mother had loved. This house was his sanctuary, a place built not with a loan from a bank, but with the fruits of his own discipline and foresight. It was a home whose foundations were solid in every sense of the word. His company, Ironwood Holdings, LLC, had also grown. It was still a one-man operation, but it was a respected name among a small circle of real estate agents and contractors. He now owned 4 rental properties, all of them well-maintained and profitable. He was known as a serious, no-nonsense buyer who did his research, paid in cash, and closed deals without drama. The quiet, grieving son had been replaced by a shrewd, decisive investor. The vulnerability his siblings had exploited was gone, replaced by a core of steel. He was patient, he was methodical, and he was waiting, though he himself wasn't entirely sure what he was waiting for. He only knew that the story was not yet over. The turning point, the moment when his patient strategy would finally intersect with the hand of fate, came on a rainy Wednesday in October. He was at his desk in his home office, reviewing property tax assessments, when his phone rang. It was a real estate agent named Sarah, a sharp, efficient woman he had worked with on his last 2 purchases. "Liam, got a minute?" she asked, her voice brisk. "Something just came across my desk, and I thought of you before I even put it on the MLS. It's an older place, a colonial, needs a little love, but the bones are solid. The owners are being relocated for work, and they need to move fast, like yesterday. It's over on Chestnut Street." Liam's entire body went still. He felt a jolt, a sudden, powerful surge of energy that was so intense it was almost electric. Chestnut Street. He kept his voice perfectly level, a mask of professional calm. "Oh, really? What's the address?" "Number 12, she said, oblivious to the bombshell she had just detonated. "It's a lovely block. I can send you the preliminary listing details if you're interested." "Yes," Liam said, his voice a low, steady baritone that betrayed none of the storm raging inside him. "Send it over. I'm very interested." He hung up the phone, and for a long moment, he just stared out the window at the rain falling on his garden. It was here, the opportunity, the one he had never dared to actively seek out, for fear it would never come. It had simply arrived, delivered by a random twist of fate. It felt like the universe was finally presenting him with a bill to be paid, only he was not the debtor. He was the collector. The agent's email arrived a minute later. He scanned the photos. The house looked tired. The new owners had painted the living room a garish shade of gray. His mother's garden was a tangled, overgrown mess of weeds, but it was all there. The familiar lines, the sturdy oak tree, the slight sag in the porch roof he had always meant to fix. He looked at the asking price. It was fair, perhaps even a little low, a reflection of the seller's urgent need to move. He didn't hesitate. He didn't call Sarah back. He called his lawyer. "I'm sending you a real estate listing," he said, his voice crisp and clear, the voice of the CEO of Ironwood Holdings. "I want you to draft an offer for the full asking price. It will be all cash, no inspection contingency, and we can close in 15 days. The offer is to be made by Ironwood Holdings. My name is not to appear on any of the initial paperwork." It was an offer designed to be irresistible. For a seller in a hurry, an all-cash offer with no contingencies is the holy grail. It bypasses the lengthy and uncertain process of mortgage approvals and eliminates the risk of a deal falling through over minor inspection issues. It is the cleanest, fastest way to sell a house. As Liam knew it would, the offer worked its magic. Within 3 hours, his lawyer called him back. "They accepted," he said. "No counteroffer. No questions asked. They're thrilled. The house is yours." Liam closed his eyes and took a long, slow breath. His. The word echoed in the quiet of his office. He had done it. Over the next 2 weeks, the transaction moved with silent, legal efficiency. Liam never spoke to the sellers or the agent again. His lawyer handled everything. On the day of the closing, he simply received a secured email with a file of signed documents and a short message, "Congratulations. The property at 12 Chestnut Street is now officially owned by Ironwood Holdings, LLC. The keys are in the lockbox on the front door." And Pefren. That evening, as dusk was settling, Liam drove his simple car down the familiar streets of his old neighborhood. He parked a block away and walked, the crisp autumn air feeling electric on his skin. He walked up the familiar flagstone path, his heart a steady, rhythmic drum in his chest. He stood before the front door for a long moment, then reached into the lockbox and retrieved a single, shiny brass key. It slid into the lock with a satisfying click. He stepped inside. The house was empty, echoing, and it smelled of strangers. He walked through the rooms, his footsteps loud on the bare hardwood floors. This was where his mother had died. This was where his siblings had betrayed him. This was where his old life had ended. But as he stood in the center of the living room, a profound sense of peace washed over him. This was no longer a place of ghosts and grief. It was a place of possibility. It was a blank canvas. The next day, a small, discreet team of contractors arrived. They were craftsmen Liam had worked with before, men who were skilled, reliable, and knew not to ask questions. The restoration began. The garish gray walls were repainted in the soft, warm ivory he remembered. The hardwood floors were sanded and refinished, their deep, original grain brought back to life. But the most important work he saved for himself. Every weekend, he would come to the empty house alone and work in the garden. He pulled the weeds, pruned the overgrown rose bushes, and tilled the soil, slowly and painstakingly bringing his mother's sanctuary back from the brink of decay. He was not just renovating a house, he was reclaiming a legacy, and he was setting a stage. His siblings, lost and broken, were about to come searching for a safe harbor, completely unaware that the lighthouse they were navigating towards was now, and forever, his. The ghosts of his past arrived on a Saturday. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, and Liam was in his living room, a cup of coffee steaming on the table beside him, reading a book on architectural history. His new home was a sanctuary of quiet order, a place where the world and its chaos felt 1,000 miles away. Then, the doorbell rang. The sound was a sharp, unexpected intrusion into the peaceful rhythm of his life. He wasn't expecting anyone. Contractors knew to use the side entrance, and he had few social callers. With a faint sense of unease, he put his book down and went to the door. He opened it, and the world tilted on its axis. Standing on his welcome mat, framed by the bright morning sun, were Mark and Chloe. For a full 10 seconds, no one spoke. Liam's mind struggled to reconcile the people he was seeing with the people he remembered. The confident, swaggering businessman and the polished, social media perfect sister were gone. In their place stood 2 haggard, broken strangers. Mark was a shadow of his former self. His expensive, tailored suit was replaced by a faded polo shirt and wrinkled jeans that hung loosely on his now gaunt frame. His face was thin, his skin had a grayish pallor, and the arrogant fire in his eyes had been extinguished, leaving behind only the dull, empty ash of defeat. He looked older, smaller, and deeply, profoundly tired. Chloe was almost unrecognizable. The designer clothes and perfect makeup were gone. Her hair was pulled back in a messy knot. Her face was pale and puffy, and dark circles lay like bruises beneath her eyes. She clutched a cheap, worn-out purse to her chest like a shield, her entire body language radiating a brittle, defensive fragility. Their first reaction was one of stunned disbelief. They were staring, not at him, but past him, at the house he had built. They had tracked him down through a distant cousin, expecting to find him in the sad, little apartment that was the setting of their pity narrative. They were not prepared for this. They were not prepared for the polished hardwood floors they could see in the entryway, the elegant craftsmanship of the doorframe, the quiet, undeniable evidence of his success. The sight of his home was the first, unspoken blow in a battle they had already lost. Liam, for his part, remained perfectly still, his face a mask of calm neutrality. There was no shock, no anger, no triumphant, "I told you so." He simply looked at them, taking in their diminished states with the cool, detached assessment of a physician examining a patient. He had been waiting for this moment, in one form or another, for nearly 2 years. He was not surprised. He was ready. "You should come in," he said, his voice even and quiet. The sound of it seemed to startle them out of their stupor. They shuffled inside, hesitant and awkward, like unwelcome solicitors. He led them into the living room, the heart of his new life. The room was filled with light, lined with bookshelves, and furnished with a simple, timeless elegance that spoke of quality, not flash. It was a room that felt solid, real, and permanent. Everything their lives were not. They perched on the edge of his comfortable sofa, looking utterly out of place, like two stray animals who had wandered in from a storm. "Coffee?" Liam asked, the simple, mundane offer of hospitality so unexpected it seemed to throw them off balance. They both shook their heads, unable to speak. He brought them glasses of water anyway, placing them on the coffee table before taking a seat in the armchair opposite them, creating a space between them that was both physical and symbolic. He waited. It was Mark who broke first. The man who had once commanded boardrooms and belittled his own brother now could barely meet his gaze. He stared at his hands, his voice a low, gravelly rasp of shame. "Liam, there's no easy way to say any of this," he began. He took a ragged breath, and the confession tumbled out, a flood of failure and regret. He spoke of the bankruptcy, of the public humiliation, of the creditors, of the hollowed-out shell of the company that was meant to be his masterpiece. He told him about the foreclosure, the shame of seeing that red sign on his own lawn. And then, his voice cracked. "Jessica left me," he whispered. "She took the kids. I haven't seen them in 2 months. She said she wouldn't let them be raised by a failure." He finally looked up, his eyes swimming with a desperate, unfamiliar moisture. "You were right," he said, the words costing him more than any business deal ever had. "About everything. You were right. I was an arrogant, greedy fool. I blew it all, Liam. All of it. I'm living in a motel room that I can't afford for much longer. I have nothing." As Mark fell silent, consumed by his own admission, Chloe began to weep, quiet at first, then building into a series of wrenching, body-shaking sobs. Through her tears, her own story emerged, a tragic echo of her brother's. She told him about David, about the note on the counter, about the other woman. She spoke of the terror of being left alone with 2 children and no income, of the humiliation of selling her jewelry, of the impending eviction notice. "I wanted what you have," she cried, gesturing vaguely around the beautiful room. "A nice home, security. But I thought money was a shortcut. I listened to David, I listened to Mark, I didn't listen to you. I didn't listen to my own heart. I helped them take Mom's house away from you, and for what? For a vacation and a car and a pile of things I had to sell to buy groceries. It was all a lie." They sat in the heavy silence, their confessions hanging in the air. They had stripped themselves bare, offering up their ruin as a final, desperate penance. They had nothing left but the truth. Mark took a deep breath, marshalling the last of his energy. He looked directly at Liam, his gaze now one of raw, unvarnished pleading. "Liam," he said, his voice trembling with the effort of the words, "we have nowhere else to go. We have called everyone. There's no one left. We are begging you. Please, can we stay here? Just for a little while. Just until we can get back on our feet. I'll sleep on the floor. I'll do anything. You're our brother. You are the only family we have left." Chloe looked up, her face a mess of tears and desperation. "Please, Liam," she echoed, her voice a pathetic whisper. "Don't let my children be homeless. Please." They stared at him, their 2 ruined lives hanging in the balance, utterly dependent on his mercy. All the power they had once wielded, all the leverage, all the righteous indignation, was gone. The entire dynamic of their family, which had been fixed for decades, had been completely and irrevocably reversed. Liam looked at his brother, then his sister, his face calm, his eyes unreadable. He had listened to their stories, he had witnessed their ruin, and he had heard their desperate plea. And now, it was finally his turn to speak. An unbearable silence descended upon the living room, so thick and heavy it felt difficult to breathe. The only sound was the quiet, rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway, each tick a hammer blow, marking the slow passage of their judgment. Mark and Chloe stared at their brother, their faces a ruin of desperate hope, their entire futures condensed into this one single moment. They had confessed, they had begged, they had offered up the ashes of their lives as tribute. Now, they waited for the verdict from the one person they had wronged the most, the quiet man who had become the sole arbiter of their fate. Liam let the silence stretch, observing them with an unnerving placidity. He was looking for something in their eyes, a flicker of genuine remorse, a sign that they understood the true nature of their betrayal, not just the consequences of their failure. He saw nothing but the raw animal panic of the trapped. Their humility was not born of regret, but of desperation. It was the humility of the empty stomach, not the contrite heart. He had his answer. Finally, he rose from his chair, a slow, deliberate movement that made them both flinch. He walked to the window and looked out at his own well-tended garden. "Staying here," he said, his voice calm and measured, his back still to them. "In my house would not be a good idea. It wouldn't be good for any of us." The words landed like stones, shattering their fragile hope. Chloe let out a small, choked sob. Mark's face, which had been alight with a desperate plea, crumpled into a mask of despair. They had been rejected. It was over. "But," Liam continued, turning slowly to face them. A new, unreadable light flickered in his eyes. "I have been working on something else, a potential solution. There might be a place that is more suitable." He paused, letting this new, unexpected seed of hope take root in the barren soil of their desperation. "I can't promise anything, but I want to show you. Get your coats. We're going for a drive." They were confused, whipsawed by the emotional shift, but a drowning person will grasp at any piece of driftwood. They scrambled to obey, their minds racing with possibilities. Maybe he owned another property, a rental he could let them use. Maybe he was taking them to a motel and offering to pay for a month. Anything was better than nothing. They followed him out to his car, a simple, reliable sedan, and climbed into the back seat like two chastened children, their fate completely in the hands of the brother they had once dismissed as a powerless fool. Liam started the car and pulled away from the curb, the silence inside the vehicle as thick as the silence in the living room had been. He drove with a calm focus, his eyes on the road, offering no explanation. In the rearview mirror, he could see Mark and Chloe whispering frantically to each other, their faces a mixture of fear and wild, resurgent hope. As the minutes ticked by, the landscape outside the windows began to change. The newer, unfamiliar developments gave way to older, more established neighborhoods. The streets became narrower, lined with mature oak and maple trees. It was Chloe who recognized it first. She sat bolt upright, her hand flying to her mouth. "Liam, this is the turn for our old school." Mark was now staring intently out the window, his brow furrowed in concentration. "What is this, Liam? Where are you taking us?" "We're almost there," Liam said, his voice perfectly even. He made a final left turn, and the world seemed to stop. They were on Chestnut Street. It was the same, yet different. The trees were taller, some of the houses had been repainted, but the soul of the place was unchanged. And there, halfway down the block, was the house. Their house. Liam didn't pull into the driveway. He parked directly across the street, in the very spot where he had stood nearly 2 years earlier, his heart breaking as he stared at the scarlet SOLD sign. They all sat in the car, silent, and stared. The house was not just standing, it was glowing. It was a vision from a half-forgotten dream. The pale yellow paint was fresh and vibrant in the afternoon Sunday. The dark green shutters were crisp and perfectly aligned. But it was the garden that took their breath away. It was no longer a neglected tangle of weeds. It was a riot of color and life, bursting with late-season blooms, meticulously tended, exactly as their mother had always kept it. The house was not just restored, it was resurrected. It was more beautiful than they had ever remembered it being. "My God," Chloe whispered, her voice filled with awe. Who lives here now? They must love it very much." Liam didn't answer. He simply got out of the car, his movements unhurried. He walked across the quiet street, not towards the curb, but straight up the flagstone path to the front door. Mark and Chloe, propelled by a confusion that was rapidly turning into sheer bewilderment, scrambled out of the car and followed him. They watched as he reached the porch. They watched as he reached into his pocket. And they watched, with eyes as wide as saucers, as he produced a single brass key. The sound of the key sliding into the lock was unnaturally loud in the quiet afternoon. The click of the tumbler turning was like a gunshot. The front door swung inward, revealing the warm, familiar layout of the entryway. Liam turned to face his stunned, speechless siblings. The placid mask was gone from his face, replaced by an expression of profound, chilling, and absolute control. "You asked who lives here," he said, his voice no longer just quiet, but resonant with the weight of 2 years of silent planning. "I do, or to be more precise, Ironwood Holdings does." The implication of his words was too vast, too complex for their shattered minds to immediately grasp. They could not comprehend the long game, the meticulous planning, the cold, silent rage that must have fueled such an act. Their desperate brains latched onto the only possible explanation they could conjure, a conclusion born of their overwhelming need. This was an act of forgiveness, an impossible, miraculous act of redemption. Tears began to stream down Chloe's face, but these were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of overwhelming, incredulous relief. "Liam," she gasped, stumbling forward. You brought it back? You did all of this? For us?" Even Mark, the cynic, the pragmatist, was completely undone. He looked from the perfect house to his quiet brother's face, and all the fight went out of him. He saw not a strategist, but a saint. I don't understand," he stammered, his voice thick with emotion. "After everything we did to you, you did this? You saved it." They looked at him, their hearts overflowing with a gratitude so profound it was painful. They believed they had been saved, that their brother's goodness had triumphed over their greed. They believed their nightmare was finally over. They stood on the porch of their childhood home, reborn in their eyes as a sanctuary, and looked upon their brother as their savior. They had no idea they were not in a sanctuary. They were in a courtroom, and the judge was just about to deliver his sentence. For a moment, Liam allowed them to exist in their blissful, self-serving delusion. He watched as the raw, desperate hope washed over their faces, transforming their features from haggard masks of ruin into beatific portraits of salvation. They truly believed they had been delivered. Chloe was already crying tears of joy, babbling about how the children could have her old room, how they could all have family dinners again, just like when Mom was alive. Mark, his posture already straightening, the old arrogance flickering back to life in his eyes, was clapping his hands together. "Liam, you madman," he said, a shaky laugh escaping his lips. "You absolute madman. You bought it back. We can fix this. We can fix all of this." They saw the house not as his, but as theirs, a collective prize, a do-over button on their disastrous lives, gifted to them by the foolish, forgiving brother they had so thoroughly underestimated. They started to move toward the open door, ready to step back into the past and reclaim their lives. But Liam's voice cut through their joyful chatter like a surgeon's scalpel, cold and precise. "Stop." The single word hung in the air, instantly silencing them. The hopeful smiles froze on their faces, replaced by a flicker of confusion. The atmosphere on the porch shifted, the warmth of the afternoon sun suddenly feeling thin and cold. Liam didn't look at them. He turned, not into the house, but and walked down the porch steps, his shoes making a soft crunching sound on the flagstone path. He walked around the side of the house, towards the back, towards the garden. Bewildered, but now too afraid to do anything but obey. They followed him. He led them to the heart of their mother's garden. It was beautiful, the late roses blooming in a final burst of defiant color, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and lavender. He walked to the oldest rose bush, the one their mother had called her Grand Dame, its gnarled trunk a testament to decades of survival. He knelt down, not with the reverence of a gardener, but with the grim purpose of someone unearthing a body. He dug his fingers into the soft, dark soil at the base of the bush and pulled aside a heavy, flat stone that had been artfully concealed there. Beneath it was a small, oilskin-wrapped metal box. He lifted the box, wiped the dirt from its lid, and opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a single, thick envelope. He took it out. Written on the front in their mother's elegant, familiar script were their three names: Mark, Chloe, and Liam. A cold dread, far more terrifying than homelessness or bankruptcy, began to creep into the hearts of his siblings. This was not an act of forgiveness. This was a reckoning. Liam broke the seal and unfolded the letter. His voice, when he began to read, was flat and emotionless, a neutral vessel for the words of the dead. "My dearest children," he began, "if you are reading this together, then I fear my worries have come to pass. I love all three of you more than these words can ever say. Mark, my ambitious son, I have always admired your drive, but feared your pride. Chloe, my sweet daughter, I have always cherished your gentle heart, but feared it would be too easily led. And Liam, my quiet son, my rock, I have always known your silence was not weakness, but a deep well of strength and loyalty." He paused, his gaze sweeping over his two siblings, who were now standing as still as statues, their faces pale with shock. He continued reading. "I know that when I am gone, this house, our home, will be a source of conflict. Your father and I worked our entire lives for it, and it is my deepest wish that it remain a sanctuary for our family. But I am not a fool. I know that for some, its monetary value will be a temptation too great to resist. That is why, years ago, I established a separate private trust fund known only to myself and to my lawyer. The contents of that fund are bequeathed solely to Liam." Chloe let out a strangled gasp. Mark's jaw went slack. Liam's voice continued, a relentless, quiet river of truth. "Liam, my son, this money is not for you to divide. It is for you to protect our legacy. If your brother and sister force the sale of this house, I want you to let them take their share and learn the hard lessons of this world. And if the day ever comes when fate allows it, I want you to use this money to buy our home back. Buy it back and make it your own. Live in it, find peace in it, and honor the memories we made there. It is your birthright, for you are the only one who has ever truly understood its worth." He took a breath, then read the final, devastating paragraph. "As for Mark and Chloe, love them always, but help them only when you are certain that the greed has left their hearts and not just their empty pockets. True change is a matter of character, not of circumstance. Your father and I did not raise you to be beggars at the door of your brother's kindness. We raised you to be better." The letter ended. Liam folded it carefully and placed it back in the box. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the chirping of a sparrow on a nearby branch. The judgment had been delivered, not by him, but by the mother they had claimed to be honoring. Liam finally looked at them, and for the first time, a cold, hard anger glinted in his eyes. "You came to my home," he said, his voice low and cutting, "not with apologies for your betrayal, but with stories of your failure. You don't mourn what you did. You only mourn what you've lost. You haven't changed. You're just cornered." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out two things, a check and a business card. The sight of them confirmed the horrifying truth. This entire encounter had been planned, every step of the way. "You may not stay here," he said, the words a final, irrevocable verdict. "This house is my sanctuary, my promise to her. Your presence would be a violation, but I will honor the last line of her letter." He held out the check. "This is for 2 weeks, at a clean, safe motel down the highway. And this," he held out the card, "is the number for a financial advisor who specializes in debt and bankruptcy. She is expecting your calls. This is the help I am offering. A hand up, not a handout. The rest is up to you." He let the check and the card fall from his fingers onto the grass at their feet. He gave them one last, long look, a look that held all the pain of the last 2 years. And then he turned his back on them. He walked out of the garden, up the steps, and back into the house. He didn't look back. The solid, definitive click of the front door closing echoed through the quiet afternoon. It was the sound of a story ending. It was the sound of justice. Never underestimate the silence of a person who has endured too much. Their silence is not a void. It is a furnace where patience is forged, where resolve is hardened, and where a plan is slowly, meticulously brought to a razor's edge. It is the quiet drawing of a line that, once crossed, can never be uncrossed. For Mark and Chloe, left standing alone in the garden of their own ruin, that silence was the most terrifying sound in the world. Thank you for listening to the story of the Miller family. Join us next time for a tale of twisted loyalty, where a devoted wife begins to suspect that her husband's late nights at the office are hiding a secret far darker and far more dangerous than a simple affair. Until then,